In 1989 saw Ralph Macchio return as Daniel LaRusso in Karate Kid Part 3, released during the summer and faced stiff competition that year. Batman and Indiana Jones dominated the box office, and also many other sequels came out with hits like Lethal Weapon 2, Ghostbusters 2 and Back to the Future Part 2. Karate Kid 3 was produced on a small budget of around $10 million. It managed to crawl back about $40 million in the US, so it wasn't a flop, but it was a huge drop in ticket sales in comparison to Part 2, which made nearly $100 million. People sort of expected a sequel to the original movie, but I don't think the public was desperate for a Part 3. It was going to happen anyway because Part 2 made so much money. There was a 3-year gap between the production of Part 2 and 3. The movie starts with a recap of Part 1, I'm guessing so anyone who hasn't seen the other films will have a vague understanding of what's going on, and also to set up the return of the first film's villain, John Kreese. The story picks up almost a year after the first film, and following the events of the second film. Having lost the Cobra Kai dojo and all his students, John Kreese visits his Vietnam War comrade, Terry Silver, who is also a fellow Cobra Kai karate expert, and owed his life to Kreese, who saved him a number of times in Vietnam. Silver is later indicated to be the majority owner of the Cobra Kai dojo, telling Kreese he didn't buy it for the money, he bought it for him. Silver and Kreese scheme to take revenge on Daniel and his teacher. Tony Silver recruits karate's bad boy, Mike Barnes, and promises him 25% of potential Cobra Kai profits if he succeeds in claiming Daniel's title at the upcoming All Valley Karate Tournament, but Barnes demands 50% and Silver agrees. Upon returning home to LA, Daniel and Mr. Miyagi discover that the South Seas apartment building has been demolished, which puts Mr. Miyagi out of a job. Daniel's mother has moved back to New Jersey to care for her elderly uncle. Daniel wants to use his college funds to realise Miyagi's dream of opening a bonsai tree store, but Miyagi insists that he use his money to go to college. Going against Mr. Miyagi's wishes, Daniel uses the money to purchase a building. When Daniel visits a pottery store across the street, he meets Jessica Andrews and they instantly become good friends. Terry Silver attempts to befriend Daniel under the fraudulent disguise of a humble friend of Kreese, sent to apologise on behalf of their Korean master for Kreese's previous actions, and tells him that Kreese died from a heart attack. He offers to train Daniel at the Cobra Kai dojo. Daniel accepts, and during the training sessions, Silver instructs Daniel in many cheap and corrupt ways of fighting, consistently discouraging Daniel from using his kata. Silver repeatedly invites Daniel to attack a wooden dummy, making his knuckles bleed, in revenge for the similar injury Kreese sustained when attacking Mr. Miyagi. Miyagi tends to Daniel's wounds with a special balm, but after subsequently asking Daniel about his erratic behaviour, Daniel responds angrily, saying that he is merely attempting to resolve his own problems, and that Miyagi should not concern himself with his problems if he will not help him. After several sessions, Daniel eventually destroys the entire dummy, at which point Silver proclaims that he is ready to win the tournament. That night, Silver bribes a man into provoking a fight with Daniel while on a date with Jessica. In response, Daniel punches the man, breaking his nose. Shocked by his own aggressive behaviour, he apologises for his recent actions and makes amends with Miyagi and Jessica. Daniel visits Silver at the dojo to inform him that he no longer wishes to train with him, and that he will not be competing in the tournament. Silver reveals his true agenda to Daniel, and both Mike and Kreese enter the room. After Mike pummels and chases Daniel out the dojo, Mr. Miyagi arrives and quickly fends off all three opponents. Ralph Macchio at this point was 28 years old, and still retains his youthful looks. But he looks a bit out of shape for this film. He's not fat, but just a bit podgy around his face. He's 51 now and surprisingly looks very good for his age. His performance unfortunately in the film is a big letdown. He's not very likeable in this film. Some scenes he acts all hyper and won't shut up, and then the next scene he's a complete arsehole. He acts like he's been snorting cocaine. One minute he's really happy, then the next he's on a come down and acting really grumpy. You only end up rooting for Daniel when it comes to the end fight at the tournament. Pat Morita as Mr. Miyagi does his usual solid performance and is always very likeable. One of the main reasons to watch this flick is Thomas Ian Griffiths as Terry Silver. He chews up the scenes and dialogue and is so over the top he is a joy to watch. He is a very good martial artist, as you can see during his warm up, probably the best fighter in all the series to be honest. He can be a total bastard and then downplay his character to befriend Daniel, and he does it effortlessly. He was only a year younger than Ralph Macchio when he starred in this film. During the same year as the film's release, there was a cartoon produced which only ran for 13 episodes. The basic plot is about a miniature shrine with healing powers that has been taken from its resting place in Okinawa, and it's up to Mr. Miyagi and Daniel to recover it. And together with the girl Taki, they search the globe and naturally encounter several opportunities to beat people up. The show can be purchased on iTunes or streamed via Netflix. The soundtrack to the film was once again produced by Bill Conti. He scored all 3 Karate Kid films and the follow-up, The Next Karate Kid. I personally think the music he did for Part 3 is easily the best. It's very epic and grand in scale to its sound. When you listen to it by itself without the movie, it paints a picture in your head of a larger film than the one it accompanies. The music is probably one of the highlights of Part 3. The kata training montage is very inspirational, and the final battle, the music is very emotional and dramatic and really helps drive the scene and will probably bring a tear to your eye. The score wasn't released until a couple of years ago in a very limited box set, which I managed to pick up. The score was never released when the film came out, unfortunately. Like many movies during the 80s, studios would produce a pop album to coincide with the movie's release. The Karate Kid films were well known for including pop songs. Part 3 has less familiar music, and there is even a cameo in the club scene of that 80s singer who sang that awful love song, Nothing's Gonna Change My Love For You. One song was released, however, as a single, called Listen to Your Heart by the folk rock band Little River Band. The song is cheesy but very acceptable and not too bad. Gene Siskel and Roger Ebert gave the film the thumbs down and felt it didn't offer anything new, and I was surprised Gene Siskel wasn't really that harsh on it. There were parts he liked, but many parts he disliked. He praised the villain Tony Silver, however, the main villain, for his great performance.
Come on, little man. Let's see how good you really are.
That Thomas Ian Griffith nearly saves the movie. He's a terrific villain, but I had a problem this time with Ralph Macchio's lead character of Daniel. Macchio plays him so relentlessly upbeat that the character loses the credibility of the first film. Pat Morita is fine, but then Macchio's girlfriend seems like a dunce. For everything that I liked about this picture, there was something I didn't like. Again, it's not a bad film, just not special enough for me to recommend.
Well, of course, the original Karate Kid was an excellent picture.
I think so.
Very entertaining, very intelligent. However, I've seen it, and I don't need to see it again. I don't need to see it a third time. There was nothing in this movie that is fresh or original.
Except the villain. You'll acknowledge that.
Oh, well, they have a new villain. They bring in
I thought that guy was pretty scary.
But they also had the same old villain, that guy that keeps running the bankrupt karate studio. He's back again. Gee, I'm back in business. Here I am again.
Yeah, a small role.
Here's another thing that bothers me. In all of these movies, Mr. Morita is the most interesting character.
Mr. Miyagi, yeah.
Mr. Miyagi.
Right.
He is so interesting I can almost remember his name.
Yeah, I know.
He is a nonviolent person who has a zen outlook on life and who believes that you turn things over and you don't rise to anger and so forth. Wouldn't it be fun just once if he were able to resolve the problem in one of these movies using his approach? Because the movies all end, they're directed by the man who directed the first Rocky, and they all end with a big fight, and Mr. Miyagi always essentially says, oh, you're right, my approach doesn't work, I'm going to beat the stuffing out of you, and that's the solution to the problem. And then after somebody is practically killed at the end of the film, then it's over. These movies pay lip service to nonviolence, and then they just turn into another blood feast.
One of the main faults with Karate Kid 3 is that it doesn't really offer anything new. It recycles the plot from the first film and mixes things up a little, so it feels a bit different to the casual viewer. The romance introduced for Daniel goes nowhere, and she is only there so Daniel has someone to socialise with. But many people complain that she disappears after a short period of time, which is true, but for a good reason. She at first wants to date Daniel, but the following day after they arrange a date, she says she is returning home soon, and she's going to give her ex-boyfriend another chance, so her and Daniel just stay friends. She leaves before Daniel enters the tournament. The motives of Terry Silver are completely ridiculous. No millionaire would go out of their way to make a teenager's life miserable. It feels like a plot outline to a cheap Cannon movie. Supposedly the writer and co-creator of the Karate Kid series, Robert Mark Kamen, was unhappy with how Daniel was portrayed in the movie. Maybe they changed his lines of dialogue, or he was directed in a way in which the writer wasn't happy with. The fighting in the movie is very dull and nothing special at all. Now, all the Karate Kid films put the story first before the action, which is perfectly fine, and follows the same template as Rocky, well, the first two Rocky films anyway. When I was a kid, I quite enjoyed the fight scenes, but once you see a proper martial arts film, the Karate Kid films look very amateur. But I do think the style of fighting and choreography in the Karate Kid films are done intentionally, to try and make it look realistic, but once you attempt to do that, it's not very exciting to see. The fight scenes are choreographed by Pat Johnson, who cameos as the referee. He has staged fight scenes for the Ninja Turtle films and Mortal Kombat, to name just a couple. He is a fantastic martial artist, so I do feel the fighting is staged in a simple way to keep things grounded in reality. Ralph Macchio's technique on screen is very weak and clumsy. I kinda imagined by the third film he should be bloody good at fighting, but unfortunately he doesn't impress. His finishing move, the kata technique, is ridiculous. Like all the finishing moves in the Karate Kid series, the crane kick is silly, but it was iconic in a way, and part 2's is confusing. He learnt some sort of counter technique and finishes off the enemy by pinching his nose. What the fuck? I feel this movie is very lazily directed by John G. Avildsen. The whole film feels empty, and with only a small cast it feels incredibly cheap and like a TV movie. There are no real strong establishing shots to create a good sense of the locations and environments. Once you get to the tournament, it's the only time you see a large grouping of people on screen. It all feels very rushed. The bad guys insult Mr. Miyagi, but they seem to forget, 3/4 into the film, they get their asses kicked. So shouldn't they be scared of him? There is some good parts in Karate Kid 3. The relationship between Daniel and Mr. Miyagi is still very strong, and it makes you sad as a viewer when Daniel loses his temper with him. The end fight with Mike Barnes is entertaining, and when he insults Daniel and Mr. Miyagi, it's very moving, and it finally gets the audience rooting for Daniel. The mountain climbing scene is very effectively shot. The front projection scenes are very well staged and nicely photographed. Karate Kid 3 is hard to recommend. If you enjoyed the Karate Kid series, then you've already seen part 3 and probably found it to be a bit rubbish or to be a letdown. For newcomers, well, this film is very average. It's not awful by any means, and the fighting in the Karate Kid trilogy is very weak, but it's all about the story, so if it manages to keep you interested after part 2, then give it a go. But to fans at the time, it was a disappointing end to the series, and could have been so much better.
It's okay, lose to opponent. Must not lose to fear.
Yo, I'm afraid. I'm afraid of him, all right?
You stay focused. There's a your best karate still inside you. Now time let out. Nice kick.
Now the real pain begins, Danny boy.